All right, we have a few people joining us still, but I'm going to get us started. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Geneviève Dunn. I'm the Communications and Outreach Specialist at the ISSP. Bonjour tout le monde. Mon nom, c'est Geneviève Dunn. Je suis la spécialiste des communications et de la liaison à l'ISSP. It's an honor to welcome you all to our first Food for Thought of the 2022-2023 academic year. We're going to kick off today's event with a video from our director, Monica Gattinger, who unfortunately could not be here with us today, but she sends her warm wishes. So I'm just going to share my screen and start her video.
Bienvenue tout le monde, bon après-midi. Aujourd'hui, il s'agit de notre première conférence de notre série Alimenter la réflexion de l'année. L'événement aura lieu en anglais, mais vous êtes les bienvenus à poser des questions. But there are gaps between EDI ambitions and EDI know-how. Scholars and practitioners at the ISSP have deep and long-standing expertise in inclusive research and engagement practices at the science-society policy interface. This project that you're going to be hearing more about today aimed to mobilize this expertise to help Canada transform decision-making as rapidly and effectively as possible. It advances the Institute's 5-year strategic vision to help Canada transform decision-making to meet the grand challenges of our time by strengthening relationships within and among academic, public, private, and civil society sectors. The project involved a series of workshops with ISSP members and partners. It was spearheaded by our then research director, Dr. Marissa Beck, and supported by a project team and advisory group consisting of professors, senior fellows, graduate students, partners, and administrators from across campus and beyond. We are especially grateful to our project partners, the Canadian Science Policy Centre, the Institute on Governance, the Ottawa Science Policy Network, and Science and Policy Exchange for their support and collaboration. The project discussion paper is hot off the presses, just published this week, and we have a tremendous panel that includes a number of our members who participated in the project. The project received financial support from the Office of the Vice President, Research and Innovation here at the university, and we are very grateful for that support. We are also delighted to have Associate Vice President, Research, Promotion and Development, Dr. Martine Lagacé, with us today to deliver some opening words. Again, I'm very sorry I can't join you today. I look forward to watching the video of the panel afterwards. I wish you a wonderful session.
All right, there we go. Apologies for the technical difficulties there. I hope you got the message from Monica. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. Now, with great pleasure that I pass it off to Martine Lagacé, Vice President, Research and Promotion at the OVPRI at uOttawa. Martine, thank you so much for being here. Over to you.
Avec plaisir. Merci beaucoup, Geneviève. Bonjour à vous toutes, bonjour à vous tous, mesdames et messieurs, distingués invités, chers collègues rassemblés aujourd'hui pour cette discussion en mode virtuel qui est organisée par l'Institut pour la science, la société et la politique de l'Université d'Ottawa. Greetings to our panelists and moderator, I will name them, Kimberly Gerling, Manager Science Policy Team, Office of the Chief Public Health Officer at Public Health Agency of Canada. Professor Gregor Wolbring, Department of Community Health Sciences, University of Calgary, and Senior Fellow of the ISSP, and a colleague of mine, Professor Roxana Ahmed, who will moderate the discussion today from University of Ottawa Faculty of Arts, Department of Communication, and greetings as well to our fellow students, especially to our fellow student, Behnaz Refahi. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this ISSP event, which will address the very important subject of the implementation of good practices for equity, diversity, and inclusion in higher education, that is in research, teaching, and knowledge mobilization activities. But first, I would like to pay tribute to the Algonquin people, the traditional guardians of the land on which the University of Ottawa is located. Nous reconnaissons le lien sacré de longue date l'unissant ce territoire qui demeure non cédé. Nous rendons hommage également à tous les peuples autochtones qui habitent Ottawa, qu'ils soient de la région ou d'ailleurs au Canada. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old. We honor their courageous leaders, past and present and future. It should be noted that the Indigenous affirmation resonates even more as tomorrow, September 30th, our community, as well as Canadians throughout the whole country, will mark the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Je suis ravie d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui au nom du vice-recteur à la recherche et à l'innovation, Sylvain Charbonneau, de participer au dévoilement de cette importante initiative de l'ISSP qui a reçu, comme le disait la directrice Monica Gattinger, le soutien du cabinet de la recherche et de l'innovation par le biais d'une subvention à l'appui à la mobilisation des connaissances. Une initiative donc de l'ISSP qui vise à apporter des outils de référence concrets pour éclairer et guider la mise en œuvre de stratégies d'intégration de l'EDI dans l'ensemble des volets de l'activité de recherche, dans les différents volets du mandat scientifique et pédagogique de notre institution. For the University of Ottawa Office of Research and Innovation, it is indisputable that a diverse and inclusive research environment is key to foster innovative research. Equity is yet another essential part of the equation. Building on its wealth of talent, research at the University of Ottawa aims to help our nation meet domestic and international challenges of the 21st century knowledge economy. And we are committed to do so while ensuring that equity, diversity, and inclusion are reflected in research dynamics and practices. As a matter of fact, our strategic research plan, which is aligned with the University of Ottawa's Transformation 2030 roadmap, not only prioritizes excellence, relevance, impact, and interdisciplinarity, but also knowledge mobilization and inclusion in the broadest sense possible. In 2017, our office initiated an EDI action plan for research to identify strategies and actions that would strengthen institutional commitment to EDI in research. This plan aimed at creating an inclusive climate for University of Ottawa researchers and trainees while addressing systemic barriers hindering full participation of members of underrepresented groups in research. Shining a light on concrete ways to advance such plan and expanding on integrating EDI in teaching is precisely what the ISSP's report and today's panel discussion will do. We are, of course, all eager to find out more about those 7 good practices which the ISSP report has identified to help researchers, to help instructors and knowledge mobilization practitioners integrate EDI in their everyday work. We're also eager to hear the panelists' vision and ideas for building greater equity, diversity, and inclusion in higher education from their respective standpoint. So with no further ado, I will now turn things back to Geneviève, et je vous souhaite une excellente discussion, wishing you all a successful and rich discussion today. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Martine. We are now going to kick off today's panel, and I'm excited to pass it off to Roxana Ahmed, who is our moderator. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Bonjour tout le monde. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me begin by a quick land acknowledgement in recognition that I am joining today's panel from uAlbany in Albany, New York. So the uAlbany community recognizes that we live and work on the homelands of sovereign Indigenous nations with rich histories and cultures that continue today, both within New York and beyond. So it is my pleasure to actually make a few connections between the work I have started while being full-time at uOttawa and continuing the work now being full-time at uAlbany. So it was back in 2012, so almost a decade back, I had the privilege to co-found and co-direct the Diversity and Equity Research Group, aka DIRG, with generous funding from the Faculty of Arts, University of Ottawa. And the focus of that interdisciplinary research group was actually to advance public dialogue and support for immigrant integration. And we worked closely with the Ottawa Welcoming Ottawa Week and the Ottawa Local Immigration Partnership. So fast forward to 2022, it is such a great pleasure to be involved with this project today that we have gathered for the panel, and continue and extend that work, actually, the interface of science, society, and policy through ISSP and with generous funding. Excuse me. So at uAlbany, I have been involved with the President's Council on Diversity and Inclusion, and especially looking into the communication subcommittee, and more recently have been an advisory committee member of the Diversity and Inclusive Excellence, which is also called DNIE. So also I have been privileged to take part in a 3-campus community conversation, achieving health equity through eliminating health disparities in a 21st century pandemic, bringing together uAlbany, then SUNY Downstate and SUNY Upstate, and been part of the planning committee. So it is actually very interesting for me personally to be involved in this project and take part in today's panel to see how we can move forward from ideas and identification of issues around EDI in research, teaching, and knowledge mobilization to implementation science. So on that note, let me just briefly mention the 7 good practices that have been identified as a result of this project. And we hope that you had the opportunity to quickly browse through the report that was launched yesterday. So to refresh your memory, the 7 good practices include embracing EDI as a broad, multidimensional set of ideas that shapes all aspects of research, knowledge mobilization, and teaching activities at the science, society, policy interface. The second good practice is be intellectually humble. The 3rd includes investing in relationships. The 4th is co-creating evidence and fostering collective learning about EDI at the ISSP interface. The 5th includes being engaging actually the next generation. The 6th includes taking small steps to make big changes. And the 7th good practice includes advocating for EDI-centered incentive structures. So it is now my pleasure to actually welcome our esteemed panelists. We will start with Kimberly Gerling, then go on to Ben Azrafi and Gregor Wolbring. And our panelists have been actually asked to reflect on 2 kind of questions guiding questions to make their opening remarks. And they were asked to kind of think of which ones of the good practices identified in the report they think are particularly useful, which ones are not, and if anything was missing in the list of good practices. So without further ado, the floor is for Kimberly. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Roxana. I just want to say thanks so much for having me here today. And I, like you, Martin, are also on the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples here in Ottawa. So I just want to make an acknowledgement of that before I begin. So maybe before I get started on reflecting on this report, Maybe I'll just give a bit of context into sort of where I sit on this panel. So I feel like I have a bit of a privileged and unique perspective here on the panel today because I've really sat on all aspects of that science to society to policy spectrum. So my background is actually as a scientist. I started as a neuroscientist where I was developing therapeutic medicine, but it was actually during that time that I became very invested in the idea of how we ethically use our science, because I was very frustrated about some of the stigmas and barriers that prevented science from being used in our policies and our decision making. And a lot of that has to do with sort of a misunderstanding of equity, diversity, and inclusion and how we use science. And as a result of that, I've actually spent most of my career now in the science policy space. So I've been working in the federal government since about 2016, have worked in a number of different departments, have worked in the nonprofit space as well in evidence-based decision making. And now I'm currently the manager of the science policy team in Dr. Teresa Tam's office in the public health agency where I've been working over the pandemic. And our mandate really in my office is to think about how we use evidence effectively and to help provide strategic policy advice and scientific advice as it pertains to public health. But one of the really big mandate priorities in our office is around understanding and implementing policies and decisions with respect to the social determinants of health and really implementing the concept of equity and how we think about public health in the public health space. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from. And the lens with which I was really viewing these principles is really thinking about how we take science from its origin into how it's actually used in decisions. So moving into this report, I want to say I think that this is a really important piece of work. And as a person who's really sat in a lot of those different seats, I think it's a really nice set of guiding principles that can really help us think about really implementing EDI in all aspects of that spectrum. There were definitely a couple of principles that really stood out to me as particularly important. The first is really that concept that EDI needs to be multidimensional. So I think that this is so fundamental. In my experiences, I find sometimes that equity and EDI considerations are sometimes tacked on at the end of things like research grants or policy implementation as like a check mark that you have to meet, where the reality is that a deep understanding of equity and diversity and inclusion needs to be embedded from the very beginning. So that includes things like developing our research studies through a lens of equity science. So that can include ensuring that our data indicators are disaggregated and looking at diverse populations. Thinking about if we're working with qualitative or population-based research, how are we actually going to reach hard to reach populations? That might mean having to build in time into our studies to reach different groups. It can also mean understanding the structural and systemic barriers that can potentially prevent groups or populations from being easily reachable with respect to our research. But then this also means having an EDI perspective when it comes to how we do knowledge mobilization. So that might mean, framing our KM in ways that might be accessible to different populations, or working with equity-based groups to understand how knowledge is going to be interpreted or accessed. This also means ensuring that EDI is present within our decision-making communities, having representation in our decision-making bodies. So all that to say, that idea that EDI needs to be multidimensional and deeply embedded, I think is just like the most important part when it comes to evidence-based decision-making and equity-based science. The second piece that really sort of stood out to me is that role of relationships. And this kind of gets into this sort of intellectually humble, the principle 2 and principle 3. The relationship building is super fundamental. So coming at this sort of from like a policy space and how we use science, that relationship building, especially with populations who might be experiencing inequities, is just so important, but it's also something that I think is really difficult to do in practice. And one of the challenges that came up for me when I was reading this report is that I think sometimes, we build relationships with like 1 or 2 members of key groups, and we rely on those groups as our sort of key pinpoint when we're working with equity deserving populations or equity populations. But this can also put like a ton of undue pressure on specific groups to have to do a ton of work. And that can be really challenging in practice. And oftentimes the timelines with which it takes to do work that's really EDI focused can be quite a lot longer. And we need to consider those types of pieces when we're building those relationships with equity deserving populations. So does that mean that we need to be, doing early stakeholder engagement to make sure that we're reaching the right populations? Does that mean we need to be building relationships with a lot of different people and ensuring that we're compensating people effectively for their contributions to our work? Similarly, I think it's super important that we allow for co-leadership and not just relationship building. So, for example, when we're thinking about something like integration of Indigenous knowledge, are there opportunities within our research or within our KM or within how we use that research to allow for leadership in Indigenous communities versus actually just partnering and getting input? Which I guess sort of bleeds into this fourth principle of co-creating evidence and fostering collective learning. The other piece that I think really stood out to me is to really advocate for EDI-centered incentive structures. I remember when I was doing my own research as a PhD student, I was also participating in a study that was looking at some of the barriers to particularly women in science. And one of the things that came up over and over and over again was that there are structural barriers in the ways that we do things like academic publications or incentives for getting jobs that can be really challenging for someone who might want to, have and nurse a child. So changing the way that we really think about our structures at universities or, publishing standards can sometimes be really challenging for, someone who has to be working multiple jobs or doesn't necessarily have money to publish in a open access journal, for example. So I think that that is another piece that really sort of stood out to me as well. And maybe the last thought I'll leave is that I think that while these principles are really, really important at thinking about how we effectively integrate EDI principles into the work that we do, at the real root of it, I think that we always need to be thinking about ways that we can also just reduce the structural and systemic barriers that prevent equity from happening in the first place. And this really should be our end goal in everything that we do, which is, not only thinking about how we effectively engage with equity populations, but really trying to understand and address the barriers that prevent inequities in the first place. So maybe I'll leave it at that. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. I'll pass it over to Benaz for your remarks next.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. And I would like to congratulate ISSP for putting together this comprehensive report. I wasn't involved in the process of preparing the report, but as I read through it, I could relate to many parts of it, and I can make some comments on some of the practices based on my experience. So my experience was on the including women in science and in STEM fields in academia, and mostly in academia and industry and government. So like in academia and like career. And so I had the opportunity to be involved in 2 years in Women in Math Club in the math department of uOttawa. And so I could hear many students, undergrad and grad, coming to our events, talking about their issues. We could share our ideas. We could hear ideas from outside, just executive members of the team. So this way, in my experience, I have seen many issues that women in math and women in science face, and we were trying to resolve them. So about the practices, for the first one, embrace EDI as a broad multidimensional set of ideas. A few months ago, my friend and I, we were both part of the Women in Math Club. We kind of felt that it is needed to for some people to kind of unwrap or peel the definition of EDI, because some people we hear EDI, but we don't know what they really means, what really even what they stands for, and what equity, diversity, and inclusion really means when we are talking about them. What are the issues of E, D, and I, and what are the solutions to resolve them? I can talk about it later if you want. About the second one, invest in relationships. So again, based on my experience, I worked with women in science. I think this group can be easily accessed. We can find them on campus. And I think it's really crucial to maintain this professional relationship with them in EDI research and policy making, because some issues are unseen to who those don't experience them. So if a policymaker is not fully aware of what this minority group is experiencing, so the policies might not be in line with them to with the improvement of the situation for them, and it doesn't address the issues. About the fifth one, the engaging the next generation, I think this is a good idea, but might be difficult to conduct because, well, again, based on my experience, next generation would be like high school students. But, well, we know they are teenagers and might not enjoy like talking about EDI subject, but we can always come up with some fun ways to attract their attention and engage them. Again, I can talk about it later more. Also, it might not be a bad idea to start education in the families, or even parents can be educated before they give birth to their babies. And actually, Eugenia Cheng in her book X+Y also mentioned that. And also about the last one, advocate for EDI-centered incentive structures. I strongly agree with this one, because sometimes in academia, focus on scientific research is too much. That prevents people who are interested in EDI subject to invest their time in the subject. And I think this is very important and might be easier or quicker to be conducted. But before thinking about that, we need the policymakers to be aware of the existing issues. So maybe they need to be educated first. And something that might not be an official practice, but it's good to keep it in mind, that about personal growth. So we are all adults, and we can think logically. If we simply be kind and welcoming to all people, if we embrace their differences, if we let them speak and listen to them, and if we acknowledge their effort and reward their work equally to others, I believe many of the EDI issues will be resolved at some lower level, not to policy and rules level, but at some personal level, it would be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Behnaz. It is my pleasure to now introduce Gregor Wilbring for his remarks. Thank you, Gregor.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm based in Calgary, and that is the traditional territory of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. For me, when I look at the 7, I should say that most of my work is on marginalized population and all kind of policy work, from sport to sustainability to science and technology. And I will focus here with these 7 points and EDI on disabled people, a group which is rarely heard. And so I decided to focus on this. And for all 7 points of best practices, I see them as aspirational, and we are not near them, right, where we should be. For disabled people, one of the basic problem is which others might not have to tackle is the very definition of disability, which within the EDI framework is really about ability deficient people. And that is so broad. When we're looking at it, you can, whether that's chronic pain, diabetes, you don't hear, you don't walk, you don't see, right, and so on and so on. The very definition as used in EDI, you can come up with mental health and so on. It's literally, I would say 40 to 60% of the university belong to the disability category of EDI. And each of these groups, whether it's ADHD or pain or not hearing, not seeing, not walking, and so on, have mental health issues, all have totally different social realities, which then have to be dealt with within the EDI framework. And as the point one says, EDI is more than just bumps in the seat and how many we have. It's more about more than hiring. Indeed, when we look at work-life balance, the problem is, right, it recognizes that there are external factors which impact, right, your situation at the university, and EDI should deal with that. But as work-life balance is used, it's mostly work-family balance. But a lot of the marginalized groups have very specific lived experiences, like Emery called it discrimination administration. You have to deal with totally different discriminations, which then impact the usefulness of EDI, right, within a university, because they're coming into the university with totally different lived experience, which limits, right, what they can do. As to being intellectually humble, number 2, it talks about community of learners. And then, but this thing is, I think around disabled people, there's so much people simply are not realizing even the very definition of disability, how anti-EDI that is. And because if you define someone within a defective framework, then your questions you're asking will be mostly around the defective framework. And we did studies which showed that disabled undergraduate students do not do research because they want to work on the social aspects, on the lived experience, on the discrimination admin, and that is simply not wanted because the bias goes towards the medical fixing, which makes sense if you define disabled people within that framework. So we are not asking the right question yet, or we have a bias towards a certain area. And that means with relationships, how, right? If you want to build a relationship or invest in it, then that should mean that you first have to see how you see them. And humans don't do very well to accept someone else as an equal if they define the other person as a defective product, right? Because then means you are not defective, they are defective. And that normally is already a power imbalance. If you would call people ability variant, everyone is different, everyone has different abilities, and not use this deficiency as a premise, that would be a different story. So this whole thing would have to be rooted the imagery to start with. And that then leads to research questions, how we teach, what do we teach, and what topics do we teach. When you look at the academic literature, a lot of topics which impact disabled people, whether it's environmental activism, emergency management, artificial intelligence, does not cover disabled people as to how does it impact them within their social reality. If it only covers them within, well, it causes impairment. Co-creation then is also, I think it's a privilege, because if you have no job, no food, no transportation, you can't read the material, how can you co-create? You don't even know where you should be. You don't even know that, I mean, and one of my students did a master's thesis, and we call this anticipatory governance, which is a big term within science and technology governance. But for that, you have to do anticipatory advocacy to be part of the anticipatory governance. And who can do that? I can do that as a disabled person at the university in a very privileged position because I don't have the other problems. But most disabled people can't do that. And that's why the disability rights groups are normally not involved, because they don't get a job, period. So why would there be a man getting involved in learning about how AI and robotics cuts down the job opportunities even more? I mean, the reality is only 30% have a job to start with. And that means next generation. In STEM, we know they're saying to get women into STEM, you have to do that all the way back into elementary school. And that means you have to totally re-engage what kind of pride you give to disabled people in schools. Right? And there is a totally missing. You don't train them there. You can become a scientist. You can become a researcher. I mean, you're lucky if they let you go through, I mean, the school. Small steps, yes. But I mean, I'm now in Canada 30 years. And I think we're going actually backwards, not forward. I still have the same problem infrastructure-wise I had 30 years ago, if not more. So the small steps, right? I mean, it's like, yeah, but I need systemic changes how you see disabled people. COVID showed how they are sidelined, all the people we see as ability deficient, whether it's the elderly, right, or disabled people. So there's much more which has to be done. And then at EDI-centered incentives, of course, we need that. But what incentive would you give to someone as a disabled person who doesn't even want to out themselves? Because as the 2019 study showed about the position of academics, researchers, the explain harassment and unfair treatment, disabled people, so the ones who declared themselves, had the highest percentage, higher than indigenous people, higher than ethnic minorities, higher than women. Right, highest level in unfair treatment and harassment. If that is a reality, even for right the faculty and so on, well, you very likely don't even disclose because it will just hurt you. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregor. So, excuse me. Thank you to all of you, actually, for making your opening remarks. We are going to engage in some discussion now. So let me just quickly try to summarize some of the highlights that stood out to me. So all of you made important remarks about the EDI issues, starting from how EDI needs to be multidimensional, taking a multidimensional approach to issues around EDI, taking a more holistic and integrative approach to EDI in research, to raising awareness around issues of EDI, especially the importance of education in the early years, and also the importance of asking the right questions to unpack the complexity surrounding issues of EDI with a more focus on disability issues. So I want to start us off with a more general question that I'm going to pose to all three of you. And if you could each take some, moments to reflect on the question, that would be really great. So let us think about moving from the identified good practices to implementation. So what are the next steps that you think individuals and organizations can take from moving moving from ideas to implementation? Thank you. So did you want me to, you could either go in the same order you presented, or I'm, happy to take volunteers, or I can pick folks.
I'm happy to go first if you like. I think there's also a raise hand feature that we can use too, if that's helpful. I don't know if you can see it, but yeah. So, I mean, there's a couple of things from my point of view that are necessary for implementation. I totally agree with what the other panelists said, is that I think we need to be thinking about enabling all people from the very, very early stages. And this is kind of what I was getting at in my sort of closing, which was that we can't really address EDI without dismantling inequity and really starting to address some of the structural barriers that create inequity in the first place. So that includes things like ensuring that we're thinking about supporting all people from the very, very early stages of education to, working on big issues like poverty and working on big issues like gender inequity. Like that, it's such a fundamental thing to say that it sounds silly to say out loud, but it's just so important. But I mean, those small steps are super important. So I do think that like things like representation is super important. And Ben, as you brought this up in your remarks, that ensuring that we have representation in things like our decision-making circles and really deep understanding of what inequities actually mean for how we're actually using evidence. Because you can't make good decisions with evidence, even if it's excellent equity-based science, you can't make good decisions with those unless you have people who really think about how that evidence is going to be used in practice. Another thing that I think we can think about is building time into the processes, whether that's time in our research, time in our policymaking processes. Like I was saying before, I think that sometimes EDI gets tagged on as like a check mark of just doing an assessment of things like policies or practices to say, have we thought about equity? Have we engaged with, specific populations that are equity populations? But I think that real EDI implementation takes the time, and we need to build that into the way that we do science or policymaking. And also just having the right frame. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is how we build equity into things like our decision-making. And that can be having, the right indicators in place so that we're actually collecting the right data, disaggregating our data in practice. Building out from existing frameworks like the gender-based analysis plus framework that's used in government, could we use similar equity-based frameworks in other decision-making processes, or to guide the way that we make policies or the way that we interact with our stakeholders? So those are just some of my like off the cuff kind of thoughts, but I think there's a lot of things we can do.
Thank you, Kimberly. Gregor?
Yeah, let's give one example. When you go into the building, you assume, you take for granted that you have a washroom, right? You don't call yourself deficient because you need a washroom, which of course every human needs a washroom, you're all deficient therefore, right? You take this for granted. You would not say you're getting accommodated. I come with my wheelchair washroom, and then I have to define myself as walking impaired. I have to define myself as getting accommodated due to my deficiency. And that already sets a relationship, right? The privileged ones can take their deficiencies for granted because they have the deficiency of the majority, and they're getting accommodated by default. And I have to be simply thankful. And I mean, so the Employment Equity Act, which uses also deficiency language, they are revamping it in the moment. And I can only hope that they're getting away from the deficiency language of disabled people, right? Because if accommodation is like, I have to be grateful, and the others not, I mean, we will never be on an equal playing field. And so we will all the time lose out.
Thank you, Gregor. Before I give the floor to Behnaz, I just wanted to bring the audience's attention to the fact that it is time for you to pose your questions or comments in the Q&A box. We will attend to those shortly. Behnaz, on to you.
Thank you. I was thinking, well, because my experience again is on academia and some industries, maybe having a dedicated group research just to EDI in each company or in each university would not be a bad idea. And like people with full-time job just working as EDI. I know there are some people in CD of Ottawa working, I mean, there are EDI councils, which is great. And they can cover many aspects of the EDI. I know they have workshops, they have seminars. This is great. We can learn from them. It can be generalized to other organizations, companies, and academia, or I don't know, schools in any communities in Canada also. But you know, there, like in university, I know there are some EDI representative, but it might not be that efficient. So efficiency is very important too. You might have the person have the group, but are they efficient? Do you see any result? Do you see any sign of EDI activities happening? Is there any workshop? Is there any seminar? Are the issues are getting resolved, are getting lifted? If yes, that's really good. We can improve that, but this is really good. We can learn from them. So monitoring is again very important to check the efficiency. But again, we need to make sure that other panels also touch based on that it's important to reach out to diverse groups, make sure your groups are included of all the EDI aspects. But I think as the next, as the transformation from theory to implementation, we need people dedicated to the work.
Thank you, Benaz. We would like to now take at least, the couple of questions that we have in the Q&A. So we have an attendee asking the panelists if you could highlight some specific strategies to embed EDI meaningfully in knowledge mobilization. So this question is posed to the panelists, and I believe Kimberly wants to answer. Thank you.
No, this is something I've been thinking about a lot actually lately. I was working recently with a document that I was working on that we were trying to reach a lot of different populations, and so this is something I was actually thinking about quite a lot. But I would say that the most simple answer is to do engagements with diverse people, because the reality is that, if you don't, this is what I was getting at about representation. If you don't have good representation in the kind of decision-making community about how you're using your product, then you're not going to actually be able to know how that product is going to be understood and used by end users. So, I mean, we thought about this a lot during the pandemic with things like, public health communications. So we talked to different people and said, so an example was a document that I developed for a part of Dr. Tam's annual report last year. We developed a set of research questions to support the report. And one of those sections of the research questions was a set of Indigenous focused research questions that were co-developed by Indigenous researchers. But we actually talked to the National Collaborating Center of Indigenous Peoples Health and said, hey, how would you suggest putting these research questions out there so that they actually reach Indigenous people? And they gave us really good suggestions that, as a non-Indigenous researcher, I wouldn't have necessarily thought about. And that for them, that meant housing those research questions on a platform that Indigenous people might more frequently engage with versus something like the government website, which might not be a trusted space for a lot of Indigenous people because of a history of colonization, or publishing those research priorities in Indigenous languages, or publishing them using visuals that appeal to Indigenous peoples. So it was only through that type of conversations with your end users and who you're trying to reach that we're able to make our knowledge mobilization product accessible to people that we were trying to engage with in diverse populations. So I would say, like, the simple answer is to really think about who your end users are and to talk to them and to get their input and to think differently about how you sort of put things out into the world.
Thank you, Kimberly. Gregor, Benaz, did you want to speak to the question?
I rarely get to the knowledge mobilization besides that I publish open access. But because, all my work shows that we don't even have, the stage of knowledge production yet. Right? So, it's biased. The research questions are biased. The funding is biased. Right? The people we are involved, is biased. It's even there. We first, and I think it's often unconscious. You don't know. So I'm in the moment a lot into to have tools which can be given to every student at the beginning of the university or anyone in the university, a self-assessment tool to even become aware of their own gaps of knowledge, their own biases, without them having to take lectures or whatever. You just do that. You go to the questions of that thing, and then you think, oh, I never thought about that. And to even learn, to get triggered what you don't know, and to make the connection, especially between the social and all these topics you get encountering in the university. And then maybe you see more diversity of research questions pushed, and therefore more research production and more diverse, and then you can mobilize. Around disabled people, we know plain language, right? Doing, transcription, doing, subtitles, all the stuff for the traditional impaired disabilities, we know what to produce so that it's seen officially as accessible. But that is only, I mean, technical, right? That doesn't lead to that the content is useful, right?
So Gregor, would you say that this could be more of a like a self-reflection, like a training for researchers?
Without anyone involved. You just, instead of having a pub crawl, you give every student at the beginning, when they start at the university, you give them, I mean, simply these different questions for them to even get triggered. Give it to everyone who develops AI algorithms. I mean, you can't know, if you don't know your own bias or lack of knowledge, and therefore the automatic bias you have because of the knowledge you have, you can't produce then data which is useful for the AI to not be biased, right? Because AI is only as good and there's machine learning and reasoning as the data it gets. And when the data is bad, you get a biased AI algorithm and a biased AI. That's why Amazon had to get rid of their human resource person, because it was biased against women. It was not, it was simply because the machine used what data is available and the data is bad, right?
Yeah, thank you, Gregor. And I think, it touches on and is a, good transition to Benaz, who is also, highlighting the importance of that awareness raising, that education early on. So Benaz, on to you.
Thank you. Yeah. I also had a recent experience on that. And again, I want to recall that I said, like in engaging younger generations is difficult, but we can come up with more fun ways to, again, raise the awareness to like younger generation and also kind of engage, get their engagement. So we asked a theater company from New York coming to Canada like 10 days ago. And she's a former PhD student in MIT who dropped out from a PhD because of troubles she faced in academia, like women in math problems. And so it's a fun way. People came with their families, with their we had babies, we had high school students, we had people from industry, communities advocating for women. I mean, we could gather everybody in the same space, and we provided them with some opportunities to talk, to discuss, to share their ideas, which I believe it is very important, and people enjoy that. It's not just a talk or it's not just a conference that you sit and listen. You engage in the process and you enjoy your time. So the chances that you come back or it affects your later thoughts is more highly is more. So in this way we can raise the awareness in a more efficient way.
Thank you, Vanessa. So in the interest of time, I would like to go on to the Q&A box, and I see that there is actually a suggestion from Dr. Samuel, who suggested that it's time to move away from references of accommodation in double quotes. In issues of EDI, everyone should be part of the core process and should not need to be accommodated. So thank you for your suggestion. And then we also have a question from Pascal, who asked, what are some of the greatest barriers you find yourself confronted with when trying to implement EDI practices? And how do you go about implementing them anyhow? So before I open the floor to all the panelists, I just wanted to respectfully remind you that we might just have a couple of minutes left. So if each of you can be brief while tackling this question, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm going to use an example to sort of express one of the challenges that I've had, which is that recently, last year, I had a behavioral science fellow working in my team, and we were trying to conduct a study where we were trying to better understand the barriers that various populations were facing with respect to vaccine confidence and their perspectives on vaccination. And one of the challenges that we had was like a simple challenge, which was, it was actually difficult to try and get representation in our study of various populations because we had access to a survey tool that allowed us to survey populations in Canada. But when we were really trying to get at specific populations that we knew might potentially have lower vaccine confidence or lower intentions to uptake vaccination, it was actually really hard to find those people. And I think that that's probably a challenge that's experienced by a lot of researchers and a lot of policymakers as well, which is when you're trying to actually engage meaningfully with diverse populations. It can be challenging to whether that's because they're difficult to, make relationships with because of, extraneous circumstances or structural barriers. So it actually took quite a lot of time to even figure out how to access them, or even just that we weren't the right messengers to sort of engage with those people. So I think that can be a real challenge is trying to do meaningful equity-based work can sometimes mean having to do a lot more work in the lead up, which is forming those relationships. So I was happy to see that relationship building is real.
Thank you, Kimberly. And Greg and Gregor and Benaz, we have 1.5 minutes. So if you could just split it between the two of you, that would be great. Thank you.
Well, the first one, I already talked about accommodation, so I don't have to do that. And the barriers is perception, is labeling, right? The very starting point.
Thank you. And probably, we could have much room left to work around how to dismantle those labels. Yes, thank you. Benaz, on to you.
I would say, like the seventh practice, we mentioned advocate for EDI-centered incentive structures. I'm facing that difficulty very much. I see that they can be, I have many ideas. I feel I can have the potential to do something, but just work commitment or academic commitment are too much that they don't allow me to do something else. That's my difficulty.
Thank you, Benaz. On to you, Genevieve.
All right, so thank you everyone for participating in today's event. I want to give a special thank you to Gregor, Roxana, Kimberly, Benaz, Martin, as well as Monica for coming to the table today and discussing this topic. I'm excited to announce that this is not the end of the EDI discussion at the ISSP. We will be hosting another panel discussion as part of the 2022 CSPC conference. So I've posted a link in the chat to that event where you can find more information about the panel and how we're evolving the conversation. Just something to keep in mind that this panel will be offered exclusively to the CSPC conference attendees. So if you want to hear the conversation and take part in it, make sure that you register for the conference. Otherwise, thank you all for your time over your lunch hour today. It was a pleasure to take part in this really fascinating conversation, and I'm excited to see our network help move forward these EDI principles into implementation. So thank you all very much for your time and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.